So today we're going to actually get into our first system. So again, remember, from here on out, we're going to be basically going through the different organ systems all the way through 202. So our very first system is going to be the integumentary system. So the term integument means covering. So our integumentary system is, of course, going to include our skin, which covers our entire body. And then it's going to include all kinds of accessory structures: hair, nails, sweat glands, oil glands that we're going to call sebaceous glands. So that's all included in the integumentary system. So we consider each of these as an organ. Like skin is considered an organ, hair is considered an accessory organ, nails, sweat glands, sebaceous glands. So all of those are going to be considered organs of this organ system, the integumentary system. And so our skin, or we also, again, referred to it as the cutaneous membrane in the last lecture, but the skin is going to be our largest organ of the body. So when you're talking about your skin, it has a surface area of, on average, about 2 square meters or about 22 square feet. And it can account for about 7% of our total body weight. Again, this is on average. It's going to be different from individual to individual, but that can be up to about 11 to 12 pounds. So you don't need to know any of these numbers. I just think that it's interesting to talk about. But I do want you to know that skin is considered to be one of our largest organs of the body. And so skin has all of these really important functions, right? First and foremost, it's our main barrier. So it's going to help protect us. And it's going to protect us from, the environmental elements. It's going to protect us from things like bacteria. Because without skin, we would very quickly fall prey to all of these really harmful pathogenic bacteria that are out there. We would also kind of perish from like heat loss and water loss without our skin as this barrier. So again, it provides this layer of protection between us and the environment. It's going to help in terms of body temperature regulation. Again, it's going to help us to prevent heat loss, but also it will help us regulate our body temperature if we're too hot. Okay, we can sweat through our skin through these special eccrine that we'll talk about a little later in the lecture, sweat glands. We also have cutaneous sensations. So this is going to provide us with some sensory information. It's like when you push on your skin, right? You scratch it, you feel that sensation. And that, again, helps us to provide protection. If you have a thorn that pokes you, when you can feel that, you're going to move away from it very quickly. Or if you feel heat on your skin, you'll very quickly move away from it. Metabolic functions. So we'll talk about how it's very important in the function of synthesizing vitamin D. And then it also is going to act as this blood reservoir, which it actually carries up to 5% of the body's total blood volume. So kind of interesting. And then lastly, it's very important in terms of the excretion of waste. So again, we're going to sweat a lot of these waste products off, especially salts, ammonia, urea, uric acid, those types of things. Again, just excretion of waste is really what I want you to know there. Okay, so now we're going to get into the structure of skin. So when we talk about skin actually consists of 2 distinct layers. And I'm going to go ahead and see if I can get my pen to work for me here. So when we are talking about skin, we are talking about the epidermis and the dermis. So it's going to be this layer here on top, the epidermis, down to this layer here. Okay. Now what's called the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer is actually not considered part of the skin. It lies underneath the skin. Now, we consider it important here because it does help to provide some of those same skin protective properties. So we mention it here, but again, it's not actually part of the skin. So really important to know that the skin really just consists of the epidermis and the dermis only. That's what makes up the skin. Okay, so again, the skin has this epidermal layer, which is your really superficial layer up here, and it's going to consist of epithelial tissue, and it's really important to know that this layer, the epidermis, is avascular, okay? Now, the dermis that lies right below that epidermis is going to be vascular. So it's going to contain the blood vessels, and what's going to happen is these blood vessels here that are carrying, they're going to carry nutrients and oxygen to these cells of the dermis that are right below the epidermis. And then some of those nutrients then will be transferred from cell to cell from the dermis into the epidermis. But as you can see, as you get farther and farther away from the dermis, then you're getting farther and farther away from those cells that, again, can transfer nutrients. And so what ends up happening is the cells, as you move farther up here, are actually going to die because they're getting too far away from that vascularization of the dermis. So kind of interesting. So again, epidermis, avascular, and again, consists of epithelial tissue. We'll talk more about that. And then the dermis is going to be mostly this fibrous connective tissue, okay, that we'll talk about, especially things like your areolar connective tissue. And it's going to be highly vascular. So again, the hypodermis is going to be this layer right here, and that hypodermis is going to be just below or deep to the skin, so just below the skin. And again, it's a big part, not part of the skin. But it does share some of its functions. So it's going to share some of the protective functions. And as you can see, it consists mostly of this adipose tissue. And that adipose tissue is going to help absorb shock. You know, if someone kind of hits you in that subcutaneous layer will help absorb some of that shock. And then it's also going to provide insulation as well. So again, that will help in terms of thermoregulation. And then lastly, of course, it's going to anchor the skin to the skin above it to underlying structures, especially muscle. Okay. So you can see here, this is kind of the, if you were to take a cross section of the skin, you can see again this epidermal layer up here. Here's the epidermal I'm trying to draw here. Epidermal layer is this and above. And then here, this is the dermis, okay? And you can see that there's going to be all kinds of different accessory structures that we're going to talk about. So we'll talk about hair. We're going to talk about sweat glands, so eccrine sweat glands. We'll talk about sebaceous glands right here, which are going to be your oil glands. And we'll talk also about some of these structures that are involved with providing sensory reception. So we'll talk about things like your Pacinian corpuscles and Meissner's corpuscles and things like that. So we'll get into all that. First, we're going to really briefly talk, not briefly, actually, we're going to go into quite a bit of detail on the overview of the epidermis. So when we look at the epidermis, again, remember the epidermis is just this outermost layer. But believe it or not, this outermost layer, we're going to break it up into like 4 to 5 different parts. So when you look at this epidermis, the epidermis consists of, remember, this stratified squamous epithelium. So all of this here is going to be the stratified squamous epithelium, and it's actually going to be in the skin keratinized. So again, that keratinization we'll talk about is going to be really important. Keratin. I need a better writing utensil here because this one is just too slow for me. So you can see that's keratinized if you want to add that there in some writing that doesn't look like a kindergartner did it. And Actually, I think my kindergartner writes better than that. But anyway, I digress. So again, this stratified squamous epithelial layer that makes up the epidermis is avascular. It contains no blood vessels. Remember, that's all in the dermis. There are going to be 4 different types of cells. We're going to talk about them in a little more depth in just a minute, called keratinocytes. That's supposed to be melanocytes. There's a little typo there. Melanocytes, the Langerhans cells, and Merkel cells. And we're going to talk about the 5 distinct strata of cells here. So let me go into this. Oh, here we go. Here's the 4 different types of cells of the epidermis. So again, we're going to have the keratinocytes. That's the majority of the epidermis. When you're talking about the epidermis, the keratinocytes are going to make up 90% of the cells in the epidermis. And then we've got the melanocytes, which are going to actually make that pigment melanin. And that melanin is actually going to contribute to our skin color. And again, our genetics will determine basically how much melanin these melanocytes are going to make. And that melanin does some really good things for us in terms of helping to absorb some of the damaging UV light. So go melanocytes, right? We need that here in Arizona. And then our Langerhans or dendritic cells, I'm old school, so I refer to them by the scientists who discovered them. So you'll hear me mention Langerhans cells, but anytime I give you the 2 names of it, I will also give you the 2 names on the exam as well. So the Langerhans cells or dendritic cells are going to be these immune cells, and their main function is just to basically kind of act as kind of a survey cell and help to activate the immune system if, an invader is found in this layer. And then these macrophages, again, there's like macrophage type cells, so they'll actually engulf whatever it is. If it's a bacterial cell or something like that, it'll actually engulf it and then activate the immune system. And then the Merkel cells are actually going to be these sensory cells, these tactile sensory cells. But I'm not going to talk a whole lot about them other than to tell you that they're tactile sensory cells, because we are going to talk about them in the nervous system at the very end of the semester. So that's all you have to know here is Merkel cells are these tactile sensory cells, again, in the epidermis. So let's go ahead and talk about these distinct layers, these 5 distinct layers that we're going to see in the epidermis. So again, we're going to talk a little bit about thick skin and then thin skin. Thin skin is only going to contain 4 layers. So thin skin will only contain the stratum basale, the stratum spinosum, the stratum granulosum, and the stratum corneum. Okay, only in thick skin, and specifically the thick skin in the palms of your hands and the tips of your finger and then the bottom of your feet. So that stratum lucidum is only going to be found in those areas. So I'll get into that as we get into the slide on stratum lucidum. So you can see here the stratum basale is going to be at the very bottom here, and we'll talk about the fact that this is where you would see your Merkel cells and then your melanocytes and things like that will oftentimes, again, be down here as well. And then we have the stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum. Again, stratum lucidum is only going to be in those areas of the thick skin, like the palms of your fingers, and again, the bottoms of your feet and things like that. And then really the palms and the tips of your fingers. So it's really only in those 3 areas. And then stratum corneum is going to be the dead layer of cells that you're going to have at the top. It's actually really quite thick. So again, this is showing you just another depiction of this. And then, I liked this one because it showed you kind of where the Langerhans cells will be. Oftentimes the Langerhans cells are going to be in the stratum spinosum layer, and they're going to be, again, doing some immune surveillance and things like that. So our first layer, we're going to go, again, that we consider the first layer, this very bottom layer, okay? And so here, down below here is going to be the dermis. So here's our first layer right here of the epidermis, and that's going to be the stratum basale, okay, or basal layer. You'll also hear it called stratum germinativum, okay? And the reason that we call it that is like it's the layer that has germ cells. So these cells are going to be undergoing rapid cell division. So stratum basale is probably more commonly used just because it's shorter, but you'll also hear it called stratum germinativum. So this layer is the deepest of the epidermal layers. Again, it's really firmly attached to the dermis. And think mitosis. Here are the cells that are undergoing mitosis, okay? And then those daughter cells will actually get pushed up. So if you picture a cell here undergoing mitosis and then producing two daughter cells, one of the daughter cells will stay in the stratum basale, okay, again, to act as a stem cell and to continue to produce the next layer of cells. But one of the daughter cells will get pushed up, okay, and it'll get pushed up into the stratum spinosum and eventually get pushed up again all the way up here to the stratum corneum. One daughter cell will journey from the basal layer up to the top of the stratum corneum in about 25 to 45 days. And as it again moves towards the surface, that cell is going to die. So, and then when we talk about that stratum basale, again, there are going to be about 10 to 25% of this layer is also going to be composed of melanocytes, those cells that are producing melanin. Stratum spinosum. So this is that next layer up. And so when you look at the stratum spinosum, this is the stratum spinosum here in this image. It's going to be several cell layers thick, oftentimes 8 to 10 cell layers. And the reason that it's called the stratum spinosum here is that when you actually do some slide preparation here, and the keratinocytes in this layer start to shrink up, they're going to appear really spiny. And that part of the reason that is that they have these weird web-like intermediate kind of pre-keratin filaments, okay? And those pre-keratin filaments are going to attach, and keratin, think about the keratin on your fingernails, right? It's pretty tough. So they're going to be these nice, tougher filaments that are going to attach to the desmosomes from cell to cell, because each of these cells here are going to be connected to each other through desmosomes. And what that's going to do is that's really going to help allow these cells to resist tension, okay, and pulling. So this is why when you like pull on your skin, it doesn't like immediately like rip apart, right? Okay. And then also it's going to provide some strength and flexibility to the skin, again, because it can resist some of that tension that we have these like, guy wires inside in between the cells. And then the melanin from the melanocytes below is actually transferred to these keratinocytes. So what happens is your melanocytes are these like really kind of funky cells below that kind of look like this. And then what happens is the keratinocytes will kind of sit like this here. And what will happen is these melanocytes, so this is the melanocyte, and then here are the keratinocytes with my K here, if I can do that. And what's going to happen is the melanocytes will produce the melanin, and then they're actually going to transfer it to these keratinocytes. And so these keratinocytes, as they get pushed up into the stratum spinosum and then, all the way on up here, they're going to take that melanin with them, okay, as they get pushed up. All right, so next layer of the epidermis is going to be the stratum granulosum. That's going to be this, and it's hard to see in this picture. I'll show you a different picture here in just a moment, but this is going to be your stratum granulosum here, in this area right here. And This layer is going to be you're going to be able to see granules in these cells. And I'll talk about why that is in just a minute. And I oftentimes call this like the zombie layer because it's like the transition between the living and the dead. The cells are actually undergoing apoptosis here. So they're actually undergoing that process. Remember, apoptosis is that programmed cell death. So they're undergoing that programmed cell death. This is a pretty thin layer. It's only, again, about 4 to 6 cell layers thick, and these cells are becoming, again, quite flat. The cells, again, flatten, and the nuclei and the organelles start to disintegrate as the cell undergoes apoptosis. Okay, and I think I put that, yeah, the cells are undergoing apoptosis here. So keratinization starts here. So the cells accumulate these kind of pre-keratin granules that help form the keratin fibers in the upper layers. And then the cells also accumulate these lamellar granules. And these lamellar granules are going to basically release this glycolipid. But the big thing is, remember that it's this lipid portion. So it's going to release this water-resistant glycolipid. That's going to help to slow water loss. And so what happens is it releases those glycolipid granules, that's going to help produce this kind of waterproof layer that you're going to have to the epidermis to really help prevent water loss. So that's what creates the granular appearance to the stratum granulosum, is these kind of granules, the kind of keratin granules, and then these lamellar granules that are going to secrete that lipid substance that's going to make the skin water resistant. Okay, and then as the cells move up too far away from the dermal capillaries to survive, they're just going to start to die off. They're going to undergo apoptosis because they're getting too far away from their nutrient source. Because remember, again, down here's the dermis, right? There's no blood vessels in the epidermis. So these cells here are getting, nutrients from the dermis below as cells pass on those nutrients from the dermis. But as you get farther and farther away from it, there's just you're too far away from those cells and you're not getting any nutrients anymore. The stratum lucidum, remember, is this extra layer, and you can see it here. Stratum lucidum right here, and it's named because it's lucid in appearance, or clear. So you can see that it's kind of this clearish, translucent layer, and it's found only in thick skin. So this is only present in like the fingertips, palms of your hand, and the soles of your feet. Okay, that's it. Those are the only places you will find that. You take skin from anywhere else and it won't have that stratum lucidum layer. It'll only have 4 layers. So you only have 5 layers to your epidermis in your fingertips, palms of your hands, and the soles of your feet. That's it, okay? Again, it's going to consist of this kind of thin, translucent, excuse the doorbell there, translucent band of, again, 2 to 3 rows of these dead keratinocytes, okay? And it's going to lie right above the stratum granulosum. Okay, and then our last outer layer is going to be the stratum corneum. It's sometimes called the horny layer. And this is going to be this really thick layer that's going to be kind of nice and it's going to be a nice thick layer that's going to provide a lot of protection because this is going to be the keratinized layer, okay? So you have 20 to 30 rows of these flat cells that don't have nuclei anymore, again, because those nuclei are broken down when it underwent apoptosis. And they're basically just these keratinized dead cells that have like secreted keratin and have these great keratin fibers in there, along with that nice glycolipid that was released, right, from those lamellar granules. And so it's going to create this nice, tough, waterproof layer. That's the stratum corneum, okay? It's going to account for about 3/4 of the epidermal thickness. And when you look for this layer, again, look for a layer that's about 20 to 30 cell layers thick of these kind of flat cells. And again, though dead, these cells still function to kind of protect the deeper cells, right, from the outer environment. They're going to prevent water loss without those lovely glycolipids that were released. They're going to protect from abrasion and penetration because, again, they're keratinized. We've got those nice thick keratin proteins in there. And it's going to act as a barrier against biological, chemical, and physical assaults. So again, biological being, something like bacteria or viruses. Again, it's going to also protect us against some chemicals, right? So, to a point, I mean, you're not pouring like hydrochloric acid, right? But, if you do pour an acid on your skin and you wash it off right away, right? That outer layer of the stratum corneum has protected you. And then, of course, actual physical assaults of the tissue. Now, when you talk about humans, that outer layer, right, that stratum corneum, we are constantly sloughing off. Think about that, right? This is why we wash our sheets every so often and stuff, because as you're rolling around in them, you're constantly sloughing off dead skin cells, right? So all day long, we're sloughing off dead skin cells because, again, our stratum-based cell is making the next layer of cells, and then those cells are getting pushed up, and then we're left with our stratum corneum on the outside and these dead cells that can just be sloughed off. As you rub up against your arm right now, you're sloughing off dead, skin cells. So dead cells can slough off as dandruff and dander, and humans can actually shed about 50,000 cells per every minute. I'm not going to test you on that. I just thought it was a wow number for you to see how many cells we actually slough off. Okay, so these are just some great images of the different layers of the epidermis that you can see them. Again, this stratum-based cell being that layer right next to the dermis. And then, of course, you have the stratum spinosum. This is nice because you can see the stratum granulosum. You can really see those, that granular kind of appearance of that layer here, and then stratum corneum above it. Here, obviously, there's no stratum lucidum. So if there's no stratum lucidum, then again, it is not in the tips of your finger, the palms of your hand, or the soles of your feet, okay? So, and then here you can see, here's that stratum lucidum that would be in the tips of your fingers, again, palms of your hand and soles of your feet. Okay. So, and then the keratinization and growth of the epidermis, we already talked about this. Again, stem cells divide to produce all the keratinocytes. Okay, that's the stratum-based cell, right, layer. And then as the keratinocytes are pushed up towards the surface, again, they're going to fill with keratin, boom, undergo apoptosis. So these are all things that we already talked about. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this here, and then I will pick back up on the next video.